peat iron bit into the bog with a sound like history opening. Dark, ancient earth released its fibrous breath to the Minnesota wind as Fiona Macrae drove the L-shaped blade deeper, her shoulders bearing down with the weight of inheritance, her hands wrapped in cloth to keep the wet peat from burning her palms. Behind her, 2 summers of work lay stacked in neat pyramids across the prairie. 3,000 bricks of compressed plant matter, dark as old leather, waiting to become walls. Before her lay the bog itself, a 1/4 mile of trembling darkness that stretched toward the horizon like something from the Highlands she had left behind. She had arrived at Blackwater Crossing in autumn of 1878. The widow Fiona Macrae, 29 years old, stepping off a riverboat with a canvas sack of clothes, her grandmother's peat iron wrapped in oilcloth, and the memory of Alistair, who had died of typhus 3 months into the Atlantic crossing. She carried his absence as she carried her tools. It was simply part of her now, part of the weight she could bear. The homestead office gave her 80 acres that bordered this bog, this ancient deposit of sphagnum and sedge, and the decayed remains of forests that had died millennia before the first white man set foot in Minnesota territory. When spring came and the snow melted away, Fiona walked her claim and found the bog waiting for her, like a door her grandmother had told her would be there. The bog gave what the forest could not. Those had been Morag's words, whispered in a cottage in Glenelg, where the wind came off the Atlantic and the peat smoke hung thick in the rafters. Morag, her grandmother, had taught Fiona the old Highland ways when Fiona's parents fell to fever and left her orphaned at 8 years old. Morag had shown her how to read the bog, where the densest peat lay, how to cut it in proper bricks, how to stand them in stooks like soldiers at attention so the wind and sun could draw out the water. In the Highlands, peat was everything. It was the walls you lived in. It was the fuel that heated your hearth on winter nights when the temperature dropped toward nothing. It was the floor beneath your feet when properly compressed, the roof above your head when layered with sod. For 7 centuries, the Macraes had built with peat, and Morag had wrapped that knowledge in a peat iron and placed it in her granddaughter's hands. Now, in the summer of 1879, Fiona's hands were stained a permanent dark brown from the fibrous material. The stain went deep, not just on the surface of her skin, but worked into the grain of her palms and fingertips, the residue of compressed ancient vegetation that no amount of prairie water or creek scrubbing could remove. This was the mark of the peat cutter. Her grandmother had worn it the same way. The tairsgeir, with its long handle and its L-shaped blade angled 90 degrees from the shaft, had been designed centuries before for this work. The blade itself was 12 inches long and 4 inches wide, beveled to a dull edge that cut not by sharpness, but by pressure and leverage. She pulled the blade from the bog, twisted the handle with the practiced motion that Morag had shown her, and lifted a brick, 18 inches long, 9 inches wide, 6 inches tall. The bog released it reluctantly. Water dripped from its underside onto her boots, dark and peaty. It weighed 28 pounds, heavy with bog water saturated through its structure. She walked it to the extraction edge and laid it flat on the prairie grass, setting it down with care, as if placing something alive. Then she stepped backward, reset her feet, raised the tairsgeir, and drove it down again, the iron bit into the compressed sphagnum. The blade encountered roots and traces of sedge from millennia past, and the bog released another brick, again. For 2 summers she cut, The work was methodical and brutal, hour after hour under the prairie sun, her shoulders bearing the weight of the tool, her hands burning inside the cloth, wrapping even as she worked to protect them. The bog diminished where she worked, the surface lowered, trenches appeared, rectangular holes marked each extraction. Behind her, in neat rows on the prairie grass, the newly cut bricks accumulated, heavy with water, glistening with bog moisture. You could see in each brick the history of its making, rootlets and moss and sedge locked in a matrix of compressed vegetation that had spent millennia becoming stone. Some bricks showed entire plants fossilized into their body. After 2 weeks, when the surface had crusted and the prairie wind had begun pulling moisture from the interior, Fiona began moving them into stooks. She would lift 2 bricks and lean them against each other at a steep angle, creating small tent shapes. Then she repeated this pattern across the prairie, building pyramids of peat bricks. The wind would pass through the gaps, carrying away moisture. The sun would bake the surface. The interior would slowly lose its water content. 8 weeks of stooking. 60 days of wind and sun. The kind of relentless prairie weather that could bleach bone and break stone. The moisture content dropped week by week, 90% in the beginning, then 80, then 70. The bricks growing lighter as the water departed. By the 6th week, the weight had dropped by half. By the 8th week, a brick that had weighed 28 pounds now weighed perhaps 7. The color changed too. The initial dark brown-black of fresh bog material began to lighten, the surface bricks fading toward brown. The bricks became the color of burnt cork, that particular shade of darkened wood, and their fibrous structure became visible on every edge and face. You could see the individual fibers, the plant matter that composed them, the way the compression had locked everything into a dense matrix. When she tapped one with her knuckles, it gave a sound like hardened sod, that hollow ring of dried earth, and the sound told her that the drying was complete. By late August of 1880, after 2 complete summers of cutting and stooking, Fiona had 3,000 bricks stacked and ready for construction. They were arranged in neat rows across the prairie, their color a uniform burnt cork brown, their texture fibrous and rigid. Each brick was light enough to carry, strong enough to bear weight, and chemically stable. The peat itself was already decomposed plant matter, had already undergone millennia of transformation in the bog. What deterioration could happen had already happened. What remained was permanent. Her hands were no longer her own. They were a peat cutter's hands, marked forever with the dark stains of the bog, the calluses worn into the palms, and the curve of the fingers adapted to the shape of the tairsgeir's handle. These were her hands now, and they had become the instrument through which the bog was transformed into walls. In autumn of 1880, she began to build. The foundation came first, a trench 18 inches deep, dug with a shovel that she wielded with the same steady force she brought to the tairsgeir. She marked out the corners with twine, measured carefully to ensure the walls would stand true, and began to excavate. The Minnesota prairie soil came away in chunks and clods, heavy with the residue of glacial stone. As she deepened the trench, she struck rocks, fieldstone deposited by glaciers 10,000 years before, stones the size of her head and larger. She worked these free with a pry bar and crowbar, moving them to the edge of the trench where they could be collected for the foundation. Then she continued down until the trench bottoms sat 18 inches below the grade line. Into this trench went the fieldstone, laid carefully in the bottom, fitted together as closely as possible. Then came the lime mortar, slaked lime mixed with sand, a binding agent that had held Highland walls together for 1,000 years. She worked the mortar in between the stones, building up the foundation course by course. The mortar began to set, hardening in the autumn air. As the foundation rose, she built it higher, raising it 10 inches above the grade level. This height was critical, the barrier between the foundation and the ground moisture, the principle that Morag had taught her. Keep the actual walls raised above the earth. Keep the capillary action of groundwater from wicking up into the structure. Then came the outer wall. Fiona laid the first course of dried peat bricks in running bond, the standard pattern where each brick is offset by half its length from the brick below, the overlapping arrangement that distributes weight and creates structural strength. She had learned to judge this by eye and by feel, the way that 3 bricks in one course would rest on 4 bricks below, creating an interlocking system. The peat bricks, with their rough and fibrous surfaces, bound to each other without mortar through friction and weight alone. The traditional Highland method that Morag had taught her in the cottage in Glenelg, in the smell of peat smoke, in the sound of Atlantic wind. She set brick after brick, checking each one for level and plumb, tapping them slightly to seat them together. The rough surfaces of the peat bricks, still fibrous and uneven from their formation in the bog, locked together like puzzle pieces. Course after course the wall rose. 9 inches it grew, the height of 2 courses of bricks plus their natural interlocking. The structure took shape against the prairie sky, a dark brown mass that seemed to grow from the earth rather than rest upon it. Then the air gap. This was the innovation, the understanding that separated survival from mere shelter. In Highland cottages, walls were thick but solid, massive peat or stone with no hollow space. But Morag had spoken of something different, an evolution of the old methods. A dead airspace between 2 walls, a void that the wind could not penetrate, a space where the air would remain still and unmoved, unable to convect, unable to carry heat away. This was the principle that Fiona now employed. She drove thin pine boards into the outer wall at 4-foot intervals, spacers that would create and maintain the gap. The boards were perhaps 2 inches wide and a 1/2 inch thick, enough to provide structure without being wasted material. She set each one horizontally, bridging from the outside of the outer wall toward where the inner wall would be. 6 inches of nothing between them. This was the specification. Enough space that air could not move through it, small enough that warm air inside would not be lost to convection. Then the inner wall, another 9 inches of dried peat bricks laid in the same running bond, bound by friction and gravity and the ancient knowledge of the Highlands. She constructed it exactly as she had the outer wall, brick by brick, course by course, offset and interlocked. When she finished, the total wall thickness was 24 inches, 9 of outer peat, 6 of air, 9 of inner peat. When she pressed the wall with both hands, it was solid and immobile. When she struck it with her fist, it absorbed the sound like it absorbed everything, the wind, the cold, the noise of the world beyond. The wall seemed to swallow sound, to darken it and hold it. The exterior finish came next, a wash of lime mixed with tallow, applied with a brush that Fiona drew across the outer surface in broad, careful strokes. The lime-tallow mixture gave weather protection and created a moisture barrier that would prevent rain from wicking into the peat. It also reflected light, bright white against the dark brown peat beneath. As she worked, the transformation became visible. The dark brown peat disappeared beneath the white, and suddenly the structure was no longer a swamp hut or a mud house, but a cottage, a proper dwelling with clean lines and the pale glow of lime wash reflecting the prairie sun. The whitewash gave the building dignity. It made it, somehow, undeniable, not something that could be dismissed as mud and bog, but something that had been deliberately created, carefully finished, intended. The interior received a smooth plaster of clay, warm-toned, finished enough to catch and hold the light of a candle. This interior surface protected the peat bricks from damage, sealed any minor gaps, created a finished wall that was pleasant to look at and touch. A standard timber frame roof, constructed from locally milled wood, rested on a pine-top plate, and the roof itself was capped with sod. Another traditional Highland method, layers of prairie earth and grass providing insulation from above. The interior of the structure now enclosed a space that was dry, protected, and increasingly warm as the understanding of the thermal properties became clear. By the time the first snow fell, Fiona Macrae had built the only peat-brick house in Minnesota territory. It stood alone on the prairie, its whitewashed walls bright against the darkening autumn sky, the smoke from its chimney rising into the cold air. It was a complete structure, finished and furnished, ready to face whatever the winter would bring. Dalton Mercer came in December with his tin star and his certainty. He was 44 years old, stocky and barrel-chested, with a mustache turning gray and eyes that looked at the world as though it had failed to meet his expectations. He was the sheriff and, more important to his own sense of purpose, the de facto building inspector for Blackwater Crossing. He considered himself the guardian of standards, the man who ensured that the settlement maintained the appearance and substance of civilization. He rode out to Fiona's property on a horse that was also, like him, carrying the weight of disappointment. He stood on the prairie with his hands on his hips and spat tobacco juice onto the lime-washed wall. The structure was a fire hazard, he declared. Dried peat was inherently combustible, he said, though he pronounced the word with uncertainty, as if he was not entirely sure what combustible meant, but knew it was something to be feared. The material violated the standards of permanent construction. The design was unsuitable for a civilized territory. More than this, beneath his words was something less professional and more personal. The fact that a Scottish widow, a foreign woman, working alone, had managed to create a structure that already showed signs of outperforming the log buildings that the settlement's men had built. This bothered him. Fiona said nothing. She did not argue. She did not attempt to explain the engineering, the thermal properties, the principles that underlay the construction. She simply listened while Mercer walked the perimeter of the building, examining it like a man looking for weakness. Mercer posted a notice on the door, writing in his official capacity, "Structure of combustible bog material, condemned as fire hazard." The notice went on to state that the building must be demolished and rebuilt to proper specifications within 90 days. After 90 days, he stated, he would have the authority to order demolition and removal at the owner's expense. He fixed the notice with nails and spoke the terms aloud, as if the building itself needed to understand the judgment being passed. Fiona said nothing. She didn't argue. She didn't explain the true nature of peat, that it was already decomposed material, that it required sustained heat and oxygen to truly burn, that in a wall it would smolder and self-extinguish rather than ignite into flame. She didn't mention the lime-tallow wash that protected the exterior. She didn't speak about the double wall system or the air gap or any of the engineering that made her house safer than Mercer's own log-walled office. She simply watched as he rode back to town, his business completed, his judgment rendered. At the saloon that night, Mercer told anyone who would listen about the Scottish widow and her swamp hut. He described the peat bricks with a kind of theatrical disgust, made jokes about bog mud and wetland construction. He chewed tobacco and laughed, and the laughter found its way through the settlement to the homesteads around Blackwater Crossing. Soon everyone knew about the condemned peat house. The widow Macrae's foolish experiment became a source of amusement. The men would talk about it and shake their heads and wonder how she had managed to assemble such an obviously unsuitable structure. The understanding was settled. The peat house would fail. It was only a question of when. But the first winter proved something that Mercer had not imagined. The temperature dropped to -30 on New Year's Day of 1881. The wind howled across the prairie like something alive, something with intent. The snow had accumulated to 2 feet, and the wind was pushing it into drifts 10 feet deep. It was cold enough to stop the world, cold enough to steal human warmth in minutes. Fiona lit a fire in her cast-iron stove on the afternoon of January 1st. It was a small fire, deliberately modest, because peat burned slow and steady, requiring patience. You fed it carefully, let the compressed fibers ignite slowly, allowed combustion to build gradually. She fed the stove-dried peat bricks, cut specifically for fuel, stacked separately from her building materials, prepared for this moment. The peat caught. The dried plant fibers glowed a deep amber color, like candlelight through amber glass. The combustion released heat expanding outward from the stove, filling the interior. The cast-iron body began to glow red, and heat poured out in constant, reliable waves. This was what peat burning produced: steady warmth from the slow oxidation of ancient compressed material, not the sudden fierce heat of a wood fire. The thick walls of her house, 24 inches total, 9 inches of peat, and 6 inches of air gap, and 9 inches of peat, absorbed that heat and held it. The thermal mass of the peat bricks, dense and fibrous and extensive, soaked up the warmth and radiated it back into the interior space. The air gap prevented the loss of heat to the outside through convection. The structure became a thermal system that captured the peat fire's ancient energy and locked it inside. The temperature inside stayed at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, while outside the thermometer hit -25, while the wind pushed the effective temperature to something approaching -50 degrees, while the world outside became a place where human flesh would freeze in minutes. Fiona sat by the stove through those long, dark winter days and observed this fact. She kept careful notes on her fuel consumption, measured the duration of burns, observed when she needed to add fuel and when the existing fire could sustain itself. She was burning perhaps 1 peat brick per day, sometimes less. In comparison, she calculated, a log cabin of equivalent size would have consumed an entire log or more per day to maintain such interior warmth. She was using heat more efficiently than any structure in Blackwater Crossing, perhaps more efficiently than any structure in Minnesota Territory. The silence of the peat brick house was another revelation. The thick fibrous material, all that compressed and ancient plant matter, absorbed sound so completely that the violent wind outside became almost a distant rumor, something happening in another world. The walls seemed to insulate against noise as much as they insulated against cold. Inside, there was only the gentle crackling of the stove, the subtle sound of heat shifting and rising through the interior space, the soft creaks of timber as the structure moved slightly in response to temperature changes. It was like living inside a cocoon. It was like living inside the earth itself. By spring, when the snow melted and the temperature began to moderate, Fiona walked around the outside of her house and examined it thoroughly. The lime wash had held against the freeze-thaw cycles of winter. There was no water damage, no deterioration, no signs of the peat bricks failing or crumbling. The structure was sound. The evidence was undeniable. When Dalton Mercer finally rode out to the peat house in March to see what remained of the condemned structure, he was confronted with a reality that contradicted his judgment. The building stood intact. More than intact, it stood in good condition. The lime wash was bright and clean. The walls showed no signs of fire damage, no evidence of the disaster he had predicted. Fiona's garden area was already being prepared for spring planting, neat rows marked out on the south side of the building. The structure was not merely surviving, it was thriving. Mercer did not tear the condemnation notice down. He did not issue a new notice. He simply let the deadline pass as spring became summer. The building still stood. The evidence was undeniable. The winters came and went. 1881 to 82, 1882 to 83, 1883 to 84. Each winter proved the design more completely. The lime wash held against the snow and the spring thaw. The peat did not rot. It was already decomposed plant matter, too densely compressed to decay further. The walls actually grew harder as residual moisture continued to evaporate. The R38 insulation value, that mathematical proof that the peat-brick walls outperformed any log construction known to the territory, manifested as a simple, undeniable fact. It was warmer inside and used less fuel. Mercer kept calling it the swamp hut. He kept predicting that it would collapse, that the peat would crumble, that the woman had built a tomb that would entomb her. But he did not post a new condemnation notice. He did not force the issue. The house stood. The evidence accumulated, and Fiona said nothing. But in the autumn of 1884, something shifted. A neighbor named Edward Thorne came by with his wife, curious about the house, wanting to understand how it managed the cold. Fiona showed him the walls, explained the construction, the double wall system, the air gap. He asked about fuel consumption. She showed him her small wood pile, showed him how little she burned compared to his own substantial stack. Then she did something that would change everything. She walked to the outer wall, pressed her fingers between two bricks, and pulled. A brick came loose. She carried it inside, broke it in half, placed the pieces in the stove. The peat brick caught slowly, the compressed fibers beginning to glow, then burn. A deep amber flame emerged, steady and hot, releasing a warm, earthy smell like the inside of the earth itself. Excellent heat, sustained heat, the kind of heat that did not demand immediate restocking. She turned to Edward and explained what he was witnessing. The outer wall was her emergency woodpile. The house was made of the same material that would fuel the stove. If firewood ran out, if coal was exhausted, if the settlement was cut off by weather or distance, she could pull bricks from the outer wall and burn them. The house would feed itself. The inner wall, even with sections of the outer wall dismantled, would maintain its insulation value, R20 or better. The structure would protect those inside while consuming itself for heat. Edward stared. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was looking at something unprecedented, a structure that was simultaneously shelter and fuel, a building that could survive the unsurvivable. January of 1885 arrived with a coldness that seemed almost malignant. The temperature dropped to -45 on January 8th. The blizzard began on January 9th and did not stop for 9 days. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried livestock, that buried the roads between settlements, that buried coal piles and wood piles and the careful preparations of people who thought they were ready for anything. The settlement began to freeze. On the 4th day, when the blizzard showed no sign of stopping, and when the community's fuel supplies were visibly failing, Fiona's neighbors began to arrive, not asking permission, simply appearing at her door with the understanding that this peat-brick house was the only shelter that would hold. 15 adults came to her house. Not families. She housed no minors. Fiona, the widow who had never raised kin, but adults who faced the choice between the freezing wind and the warm interior of a structure that everyone had dismissed as a swamp hut. Neighbors and acquaintances and people she knew by face, if not by name. Fiona pulled bricks from the outer wall. She went to the north face, where the wind was worst and where the loss of the outer layer would be least noticed initially, and she pressed her fingers between the rough, fibrous surfaces and pulled. 1 brick, then another, 6 bricks. She carried them inside, placed them in the stove, fed them to the fire. They burned slow and hot, releasing their ancient energy, the accumulated heat of vegetation that had died 10,000 years before white people came to Minnesota. The peat smoke filled the interior with its earthen smell. The warmth spread through the thick walls. People wrapped themselves in blankets and sat by the stove and did not freeze. At dusk, Fiona pulled 6 more bricks. Through the 4th day and the 5th day, and into the 6th day, while the blizzard continued and the temperature refused to rise above -40, Fiona pulled peat bricks from her own walls and burned them. The outer wall thinned. A section of the north face became visible as a raw honeycomb of the interior surface, the air gap visible like a ribbon of nothing, the inner wall intact behind it, still insulating, still holding the warmth inside. She was dismantling her own shelter to survive, and the house was feeding itself. On the 6th day, Dalton Mercer appeared at her door. He had walked from town, a dangerous journey in the blizzard, a journey that should have claimed him. His brown felt hat was crushed, his tin star was dull and seemed to catch no light. His tobacco was gone, chewed or lost. His office back in town was an icebox, 6-inch log walls with an R value of 8 or 9, his woodpile buried under 4 feet of snow, the fireplace drawing cold from somewhere deeper than the earth. He had left his office and walked through the blizzard toward the peat-brick house because there was nowhere else to go, no other shelter that would hold heat. He did not speak. Fiona opened the door, and the warm peat smoke smell poured out into the freezing air like a living thing. She stepped aside. Mercer entered. Inside, 15 people sat wrapped in blankets around a stove that burned peat bricks pulled from the walls themselves. The outer wall was visibly dismantled on the north face, the air gap like a ribbon of dead air, the inner wall intact, still functioning, still insulating. The fire burned amber and hot. The temperature inside was 58 degrees. Outside, the world was -45, and snow and wind that could claim you in minutes. Mercer removed his hat. He said nothing. He sat by the stove and felt the heat. He understood what he was looking at, the structure that he had condemned, that he had called a fire hazard, that he had predicted would crumble and fail. It had become the thing that would not fail. It had become the architecture of survival. The blizzard lasted until January 16th. When it finally stopped, the settlement emerged to find that everywhere else, fuel supplies were exhausted or buried or lost. But at the Peat-Brick house, there was heat. There was shelter. There were 15 people alive because they had sat by a stove that burned a building's own walls while the building maintained its insulation and held the warmth inside. In spring of 1885, Dalton Mercer tore down the condemnation notice himself. He did not post a new one. He did not speak to Fiona about it. He simply rode out one morning, took down the notice, and rode away. The tin star on his vest seemed to catch the light differently now, as though it had been dulled by something more than dust. Fiona began cutting new peat bricks to repair the outer wall. She walked to the bog with the tairsgeir, her grandmother's tool, her inheritance, her proof that the old ways held knowledge that the new world needed. The bog was waiting, as it always was. She set her feet and began to cut. The blade bit into the dark earth. The wet bricks came loose. The peat released its ancient breath. By summer, the outer wall was whole again. The whitewashed surface gleamed, reflected the prairie sun brightly, and 2 families had come to Fiona asking her to teach them how to cut peat, how to build with it, how to create a structure that held heat like no log cabin could match. At the bog, surrounded by the material of her own survival, with her hands stained dark brown and her grandmother's voice clear in her head, Fiona Macrae drove the peat iron deep into the earth. The blade bit into the ancient material. The bog gives what the forest cannot. She cut another brick, and then another, the work continuing as it would continue.